Maha, I would love for you to introduce yourself to the world if they haven't heard your name, and then we can dive into definitively your thinking and your next book, which we're all eagerly waiting for. So please.
Yes, thank you so much, Sai. So my name is Maha Hossein Aziz. I'm a professor at NYU, focusing on global risk. Basically, that means we research threats to our stability within countries, but also across the world. As you can imagine, the last few years, risk has been heightened because of various leaders and various issues that have come up. And that led to my first book, Future World Order, where I talked about our global legitimacy crisis, which I'm happy to share today. But because of the COVID-19 pandemic, I thought it would be worthwhile to reflect on the effect of the pandemic on our stability. So happy to share ideas from that as well.
That's a brilliant segue, Maha. Please, I mean, what is the impact on our stability from COVID and what we're seeing out there and what you're looking at? Please share.
Sure. So first, it's important to remember that pre-COVID-19, I know it seems like a long time ago, but pre-COVID-19 and in the 2010s, in that decade, we were already at a crossroads. We were already dealing with major challenges to our stability, geopolitically, politically, economically, and socially. And what I explore in my work is the idea that these risks that existed pre-COVID-19, frankly, have only deepened and will only continue to deepen in the 2020s. So first, of course, as we all know, geopolitically, we are aware that the world has experienced a shift, or at the very least, there's a lack of consensus about the structure of our very international system. Is it still led by the US? Is it still led by multipolar powers? We really don't have clarity, and I'm not convinced that a change in leadership if there is a change in leadership come November, I'm not convinced that we'll necessarily have clarity again about who's in charge. And what I also think it's worth recognizing is that in the last decade, we've seen the emergence of non-state actors that have at times shaped geopolitics or influenced geopolitics in distinct ways, whether it's the citizen protester protesting about climate change, or the activist billionaire offering their perspective on global policy, or even tech firms. And I think what we'll need to really reflect on in the coming decade is to what extent the nature of power is changing. Is it still appropriate to talk about a state-centric understanding of power, or do we need to accept these other types of influencers? So there's a lack of clarity that will continue. And I'll get into the pandemic effect in a second. Secondly, we know that democracy in the 2010s has been under threat, so much so that we have perhaps experienced and are still experiencing a global spring, where we've seen citizens in all political systems, democracy and non-democracies, have challenged their leaders in unprecedented ways, armed with tech. And it's leading to this larger debate or concern about whether democracy is still the best system, which is what we assumed was the case in the post-Cold War era. But again, we don't have global leadership to dictate what the best political system is anymore. So where are we headed politically? Again, a lot of confusion, and we will be dealing with this big question: do we need a new social contract in this decade as we deal with this crisis of governance? And as we see the rise of non-state actors that often have tried to shape policy domestically, the tech billionaire, the tech firm, the citizen protester. Thirdly, economically, we already have seen that globalization has a threat or an opponent in terms of economic nationalism, populism. But I think we're also going to be headed into this larger crisis, which has already begun, frankly, about who we are in relation to our work. We're headed for a massive occupational identity crisis because of automation taking away jobs. And I think we need to really explore and reflect on how are we going to deal with this new class of people that is losing their jobs or will lose their jobs to automation. Do we need a new economic social contract or a new moral economy? I think this sort of debate will be discussed quite a lot in the coming years. Again, a lot of this has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 effect, which I'll explore. My last point before I talk about COVID-19 is the social aspect, the social risk or identity crisis that I think we've been dealing with as a global community, but also within countries. Are we globalists? Are we nationalists? Care about the other. I think it's safe to say in the last decade, we've seen a rise in xenophobia. We've seen an evolution in terms of extremism. It's evolved from Islamist extremism to far right, to Buddhist, to Hindu extremism, and so forth. Do we have shared global values? I think there's going to be an urgent need to have these discussions in the coming decade, regardless of who wins the U.S. election. I think we will have to discuss these issues. Any questions about that before I go to COVID-19?
Maha, I'll put it this way: your brilliance emanates in terms of exemplifying the complexity that's before us. I mean, quite honestly, because there's so many facets. If I can ask one particular question, what is the one thread that you see connecting all those aspects that you just called out, Maha?
That's a great question. I wish there was one thread, and if I had to define or tie it together, I guess it relates back to this idea that there is no global leadership. There is not a global community of leaders that is setting the tone anymore. And I guess it goes back to the lack of clarity on who's in charge of the world order. If the U.S. for the moment or for the last few years has taken a different position, what does that mean for our larger global agenda? Does that mean that other organizations like the UN, for instance, are going to take a bigger role in setting that global tone? Does the UN have the legitimacy? Do any of our existing leaders or institutions have the legitimacy to really set that global tone and deal with these issues that are all, frankly, interrelated? I think I don't know if they have the legitimacy, and I think that's why it's encouraging to see other types of actors, like I said, the citizen protester, even the tech billionaire, at times filling that gap that is being left by our policymakers. So I think, so that's my quick response to that question.
So Maha, what leadership is needed? Can you give it form? Can you give it description? Can you? I'm trying to capitalize on the brilliance that you have, my friend. So I definitely want to kind of dig deeply.
No, thank you. What kind of leadership do we need? I mean, in theory, we should have that leadership emanating from our political leaders who are elected, but I just don't see that happening in the near term. And I think what we're going to continue to see is that the leadership is coming from these other types of communities, from non-state actors. And I don't think we can stop that. And to what extent we're going to then need to, as I said, redefine the social contract to take into account these other influencers. I think that's where we will need to put our energy. But it's a tough question. I really challenge our listeners to think about which world leader is really governing in a way that that is working for their citizens. Is it only Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand who's figured it out? That's how it feels like these days. So I think it'll be interesting to see how other types of actors try to continue to fill that gap, and what will that mean for the nature of power this decade in terms of our geopolitics and our politics domestically.
I want to ask one more question, if you will, because I love the emphasis on citizenship and the social contract. Are we truly at a point now where citizenship, broadly defined on a world stage, is redefining that social contract?
I think to a certain extent it is. To what extent, though, it has been accepted by governments, I think that's a separate issue. So I feel there will need to be a clear discussion between citizen representatives and government about what the expectations are as we navigate the 2020s. And of course, now we're navigating a COVID-19 world as well, the effect of which will sadly likely continue for a few years at the very least. So that would be that's what I think at this stage. But since I've mentioned COVID-19, maybe I can...
yes, please do, please.
So what I guess the basic point that I want our listeners to be aware of is that a lot of the risks we are dealing with now, they existed before the pandemic, but the pandemic has just exacerbated it. We've seen it already and we'll continue to see it. Geopolitically, I think it's safe to say the global response to the virus has shown we don't have leadership. And it's not just about U.S. leadership taking a different approach. I think we see that it's across the board. There's a lack of consensus about the vaccine, about what the best strategy is, and so forth. And I think what we've also noted is that there's been this emergent COVID-19 bilateralism in the last few months, where you have countries stepping up and offering support to other countries in terms of COVID-19 diplomacy, masks, doctors, etc. How will that reshape our diplomacy, but also how will that reshape our geopolitics in the coming months and years? Is that going to create new alliances that are completely separate from our discussions about a U.S. versus China or a multipolar world? I think that will be interesting to observe. But again, the lack of understanding at this stage about how these relationships could evolve is a threat to our stability. It deepens our crisis of geopolitical legitimacy. We don't really know who's in charge. Related to that, of course, everyone is aware at this stage about the vaccine nationalism that is brewing. Some countries are already offering it strategically to others. Other countries have said they don't want to share the vaccine when it comes out. So I think, again, the pandemic has reminded us that we don't have global leadership, and perhaps we don't really have faith in our current group of political leaders across the board. Maybe we need to reimagine the G7 or a sort of a G7-like advisory body, which has leaders who are beating the virus, who have had success with that's giving us advice or leading the charge against this global campaign against the virus. Because right now, the existing institutions, the existing leaders are failing. We just don't have leadership. Related to that, COVID-19 has reminded us that we don't have, there was a brief period when governments could regain the legitimacy of their citizens. They had a chance to show us that they could govern and navigate this unprecedented pandemic. But I think it's safe to say, with all the protests that have happened against government, against certain COVID-19 policies, a lot of governments have fallen short of citizen expectation and their response. And this is just going to get worse as time goes on, as we ease out of the pandemic, hopefully soon. We will question, did our governments do enough in that initial period? And now, are they giving us enough support going forward? Again, I would argue, in this COVID-19 context, do we need a new social contract that reflects the new needs of citizens in a COVID-19 world? And again, I would argue, do we need to reflect on other types of influencers or supporters? We've seen that in some countries, activist millionaires and billionaires have filled that gap left by government when they failed to deal with or come up with policies to tackle COVID-19. And does that mean there needs to be a more defined role for these activists, billionaires and millionaires? I know it's controversial to say that, and I'm often challenged on this point, but it keeps happening. Again, it happened pre-pandemic, and we're seeing it again with these other types of power players. Thirdly, economically, as we know, a lot of countries have had some success with economic relief packages to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. But the truth is, and some finance ministers have expressed this, they have said this publicly, that we won't be able to help everybody indefinitely. Small businesses, the unemployed, people who have lost their jobs and will not regain their employment as we hopefully move out of the pandemic. And I think, again, we will see more protests about economic failures of our governments. We're going to see more people who some economists have termed precariats, people who are losing their occupational identity because of this period of mass unemployment due to the pandemic. And again, it bleeds into a larger mental health crisis. Again, I would say, do we need to reimagine the economic social contract or a moral economy where we're clear on what we can expect from our governments and vice versa in terms of economic basic public goods? Lastly, I want to highlight again, everyone is aware that xenophobia exists. There is a lot of extremism in the world pre-pandemic, but the post-pandemic picture largely negative, where you see a resurgence in, sadly, in xenophobia towards East Asians in some parts of the world because of the perceived origin of the virus. We've seen discrimination against certain historically disenfranchised groups in certain countries, where COVID-19 has given an opportunity for more hate, for people to take advantage of this situation. Again, I ask, do we have shared global values? Do we care about the other in this extreme period? And I think the only silver lining I've witnessed, and I'm sure you'll agree, is the response to the George Floyd's death. The response that we saw, over 60 countries, there were protests against racism in response to George Floyd and what happened to him, a devastating event. And the fact that this elicited such a response, and it was a response led by citizens, not by our politicians, not by our world leaders, I think that's very positive. To have seen that there is perhaps a sense of shared global value against racism, there is a sense of a shared global community, even if it's not being driven by our governments or by the state. I think that is very positive. I said this in a few speeches over the summer, where in person and virtually, and I must admit that there were some people who challenged me on this and said that, people were just protesting because they were bored. They wanted to get out of lockdown. I don't think we should be so cynical. I think we should appreciate that there is this sense of a global community around a positive sentiment of being against racism. I think this is positive. Can we capture that sentiment and retain it in the coming decade? It would be amazing, and perhaps it will be led by our youth, who are more, as we know, as we've seen in the last decade, they are more engaged, they are more activist. They do want to have their voice heard. So maybe this will be the silver lining, but largely the pandemic has exacerbated the geopolitical, political, and economic risks that we were already dealing with in the 2010s, and that will probably loom over us in the 2020s. And of course, I didn't mention climate change and the climate crisis, but everyone knows the sad situation in places like California and in Brazil in terms of the fires. So, does this all boil down to global leadership? Are we going to suddenly have global leadership if there's a change in leadership here in the U.S.? I'm not convinced that will necessarily be the case. And I'm sure our viewers have seen or heard the speeches that took place about a week ago at the UN, where, it's the same sentiment that came from the U.S. leadership about looking after its own interests. We saw China being more vocal about, promoting democracy, human rights. Yeah. But that's problematic as well. So who are we to look to?
Yeah. Maha, you're reading my mind quite honestly. I mean, I want to ask I know we have about less than 5 minutes in terms of time, so I definitely want to ask one question that I think is really lurking, and you've called it out, but lurking in people's minds. Sure. And this is the thing I've always been in awe of you, because you can zoom out and zoom in. So it's pretty brilliant the way you express it, quite honestly. what has legitimacy now? What can we hold on to as a starting place for legitimacy that moves us forward, Maha?
I think that's a great question. I think the point is that we may need to reimagine our institutions, and a lot of these core ideas, they need to be revisited, right? Whether it's the social contract, whether it's this idea that democracy is the best system. So a lot of these ideas came from the post-Cold War era. The U.S. had the legitimacy to lead the global community and talk about these issues and encourage and nudge the rest of the world to pursue these values. And it's not to say that other countries haven't tried to fill that gap. France, Macron, for instance, has definitely taken a bigger role on the global stage and tried to, perhaps gain legitimacy as a global player. But the point is, it may be time to imagine or reimagine some of these core ideas and to think about where power lies or where influence lies. We can't ignore all of the citizen-led movements that have surfaced in the last decade on different issues and more recently have led to governments changing their policies. So the very nature of governance or policy making is responding to these citizen-led movements, and I think that's positive. And it leads to this larger debate: do we need to reimagine our political systems in the coming decade to take into account not just COVID-19, but of course the new influencers, the new factors, the tech factor, the new influencers in terms of the citizen protester, the tech billionaire, etc. Like I said. Maybe it's time to reimagine these ideas that we assumed would just stay indefinitely after the end of Cold War. As Francis Fukuyama said at the end of the Cold War, this is the end of the history. This is it. This is as much as our political system will evolve. Democracy is the best system. Even he has said he has concerns. It's time to reimagine the world in which we live. And to have these sorts of discussions. Obviously, conferences are important, but within our communities, we should be thinking about what it is that we expect of our political systems, and is democracy still it? Are our existing institutions and leaders, are they what we want? I'm not calling for a revolution, but I think there's a space to hear more voices and to affect change in a way that we wouldn't have taken as seriously perhaps in the past.
Yeah. Maha, you're brilliant. I completely agree with what you just said in terms of you're not calling for revolution, but you are truly calling for awakening, enlightenment, engagement, and finding our next, respectfully, best self as we move forward. And from one citizen of the world, if you will, and myself, I'm glad your voice is out there tremendously. So thank you very, very deeply, Maha.
No, and thank you for organizing these conferences. This is important. And I'm sure this will lead, the event itself will lead to, it'll spark conversations in other parts of the world amongst the people who are watching. And I think that's part of the solution for us longer term. So thank you, Sai.
Thank you, Maha. And the only thing I say is, this wouldn't be possible without your presence. So deeply, deeply appreciate your time and very much grateful for it. So thank you so much, Maha.
Thank you. And stay safe, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Thank you so much, Maha. Take care now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.